please check out my revised website at creationsciencefiction.com. It's a great resource now for answering creationist claims. There's also documentaries, lectures, my blog, and more. Like my Facebook page too, and if you want to support what I'm doing, you can become a contributor at patreon.com. Welcome to Young Earth Creationist Human Origins with Dr. Todd Wood, Part 2. In the first video, Dr. Wood went through about 4 million years of fossil evidence for human evolution, from Ardipithecus to modern humans. He looked at various features, then put them all in a chart which he believes shows a gap between Australopithecus and the genus Homo. He skipped some of the more recent finds though, so now we're going to look at those and he's going to put them on the chart and see if they bridge the gap.
2 years ago, in 2015, this guy was dug up, or actually debuted to the public. We've been excavating it since 2013. This is Homo naledi. Homo naledi, you can see again, we have a pretty heavy brow ridge. We have a very small brain case, probably 4 feet tall when he was alive. Post-orbital constriction, big hole right on the bottom of the skull. Walked around upright. What's remarkable about naledi is the evidence of burial. When you look at the taphonomy, the way the bodies are laid out in these fossil deposits, it sure looks like Homo naledi was crawling into this cave in order to drop off dead bodies of other Homo naledi, which was surprising. And most people said, well, how can something with the brain the size of an orange bury its dead? And I thought, well, if it's human, it doesn't really matter how big its brain is. Humans behave like humans. When they're small, when they're large, they might behave immaturely when they're small, but they're still humans.
What he's talking about here is the original Homo naledi fossils were found in the Dmanisi chamber of the Rising Star cave system. The fossil remains of 15 individuals were brought up from the Dmanisi chamber. It looked like they'd been slid down the chute from the larger chamber above. We really don't know if it was a ritual burial or if they were just disposing of their dead, but it was a really interesting find. We don't know what data goes into this chart, but he didn't talk about some really interesting features. In addition to the small cranial capacity, Homo naledi had narrow shoulders that were positioned in such a way it would have helped with climbing or hanging, holding their arms above their head. The pelvis is very primitive and more like the Australopithecus ancestors than any modern human. Homo naledi's hands had long, permanently curved fingers with curved finger bones that would have helped them climb in trees. I met Lee Berger in March of 2017 when he was here in Mesa, Arizona for his National Geographic Live tour. Now, the age of the fossils wasn't actually announced until April of that year, but that's months and months before this video was recorded with Todd Wood, and knowing now that they were between 225 and 325,000 years old, that means they couldn't have been a human ancestor, so they really don't belong on this chart at all. I guess we have to remember, though, that scientific dating methods don't mean anything to these people.
So this gave me another opportunity. And remember, what's our deal here? We want to find out, is this new fossil going to fall in the gap and collapse the clusters, or is it going to fall into one of the existing clusters? And guess what the answer is? Well, that's naledi right there. So naledi clusters with the other people, which I kind of sort of guessed would happen if it was really crawling underground to bury its dead. It's probably human. And sure enough, it clusters with the people.
Well, we can't see exactly what he was pointing at with the laser pointer there, but I have to think it's the gray one because there weren't any with other colors in that grouping in earlier slides. Now, I removed Paranthropus and the other apes here because what we're trying to look at is a gap between Australopithecus and humans. Now we have Australopithecus sediba, which he says bridges the gap and ends up with the species of modern humans. Now, where I think Homo naledi should be is right at the edge of the variability of humans. And that's based on the very primitive features that you see when you look at the overall anatomy. And when you look at the overall anatomy of Australopithecus sediba, it should be in between Homo naledi and the other Australopithecines. Again, I'm not sure exactly what data he's using, but I'm really not seeing a gap here when you look at the evidence. One thing we know for sure, though, we haven't discovered all the fossils or all the species that were alive at that time.
So now I've gotten to the point where I'm really excited. I'm like, yeah, bring on the next one, all right? I mean, let's see it. I'm 2 for 2. Is that right? That the right sports lingo, 2 for 2? I have had 2 opportunities here to test this clustering, and 2 opportunities have come up showing me that significant new fossils that appear to show evolutionary traits are actually clustering with human beings.
Let's take a minute here and take a look at what some of the other creationist organizations are saying about Homo naledi. Now, he's with the Core Academy of Science on the far right. He says it's fully human. Creation Ministries International says probably fully human, but with pathological features. The Institute for Creation Research says imaginary creatures. And then Answers in Genesis says it's fully ape.
All right, let's move along here. My most recent publication on this is this paper here. I can give you a copy of it if you're interested, or you can just take that title and look it up on the internet. You can read all of the gory details of my study of Homo naledi. And it has references to other papers where I do other analyses of other hominids.
It's important to remember here, when he's talking about publishing papers, he means in creationist publications, not scientific journals.
So, let's draw the line then. If we draw the line would go here. Human, non-human, right? Gap in the middle. And it's detectable. It isn't obvious by any means when you look at them first time. But it's there statistically. When you count up all those characteristics, you make your clusters, boom. This is how they fall out.
A cranial capacity of less than 500 cc's, arms that are very long compared to any human species, and like Homo naledi, permanently curved finger bones. Could this be the young Earth creationist Adam and Eve?
And yes, I call him Homo sediba. There's actually been another paper published that suggests that maybe sediba here and habilis share some relationship. Either you should name this guy Homo sediba, or you should put sediba and habilis into their own genus. So, you know, where'd you hear that first, guys? That's right, a creationist. I love it when that happens.
Well, I wasn't able to find anything about that, and I guess since it's been a couple years and nobody else has written about it, they pretty much dropped it.
All right, so let's talk about what that means then. General model for understanding human origins. What are these fossils anyway? Well, we're going to remember here that humans, modern humans, trace their heritage first to Noah. Adam and Eve are much farther back than our most recent common ancestor. And my geology friends, pretty much without exception, tell me that these fossils are post-flood fossils. They occur in relatively superficial sediments of very limited extent. Homo naledi is a great example. Homo naledi is in a cave that was probably carved by the flood. So if it was carved by the flood and Homo naledi crawled into the cave to bury it, then Homo naledi must have been living there after the flood. Yeah, right? Makes sense.
Wait a minute. If all the fossils on the left are post-flood, does that mean the ones on the right were pre-flood and Adam and Eve were apes?
So when we start thinking about different places in the world where we have early hominin fossils, and I've listed a bunch here that are well over, about 1 million to 2 million years old by radiometric dating, we find that the earliest humans we encounter in the fossil record are already distributed all across 3 continents, which is startling. So they're dispersing here from the Tower of Babel, and they are everywhere. So whatever and wherever this was here in this area, it's got to be really, really old.
Okay, so now we've jumped forward to the Tower of Babel. Let's see where he's going with this.
A legitimate question always arises. Are you really sure that this is human, right? There are creationists out there who are adamant that this is not human. In fact, just this week, there was another paper published arguing that this is not human, based on 2 pieces of the backbone and a rib. Okay, well, I think mine's a little more comprehensive than that, but that's okay.
Well, I pointed that out a minute ago, and he sure is dismissive of what the other creationists say, isn't he?
So is this really human? And in fact, after the movie came out, I got an email from a gentleman who was very concerned about my placing Neanderthals in with the human family as well. He thought that that was too much evolution, and if we say that Neanderthals and humans share a common ancestor, what's to stop us from saying, humans and animals could share a common ancestor? I hope he's not watching, because he's probably going to have an aneurysm when he sees the diversity that I have here. All right, well, let's talk about variation. Dmanisi. This is the excavation pit at a fossil locality in the Republic of Georgia. It has been long known as the site of a medieval fort, but excavations there uncovered in a small area a trove of hominin fossils. And to this date, there have been 5 skulls pulled out of Dmanisi. And I have 2 of them right here. This is one of those skulls. It looks sort of like a Homo erectus. And the general idea is that this is Homo erectus. The excavators at Dmanisi have been somewhat, inconsistent in how they refer to these. Sometimes they think of them as erectus. Sometimes they classify them as something called Homo georgicus. And I think that's just due to their uncertainty of what to do with this. These are the oldest conventionally dated fossils outside of Africa. So they're remarkable.
That's Dmanisi skull number 3 that he's holding in his hand, and you see here on the left. The face bears a striking resemblance to Mrs. Plez, Australopithecus africanus, on the right. However, the brain case is about 1.5 to 2 times the size of Australopithecus africanus.
But they do share a lot in common with Homo erectus. Small brain case, nice brow ridge, postorbital constriction, big hole right on the bottom of the skull. So that sure does look like Homo erectus. Other skulls from Dmanisi look more like the classic Neanderthal morphology, which is really interesting. So you have what appears to be erectus and Neanderthal at the same site.
Here are all 5 skulls from Dmanisi. I don't know of any paleoanthropologist that really ever compared them with Neanderthals. In fact, the cranial capacity of the largest one is way below the minimum size we've ever seen with a Neanderthal skull.
But I don't think anyone was prepared for this. This is the 5th skull, skull 5, as it is known colloquially. It is, frankly, astonishing. Even to me, it is astonishing. Relatively small brain case, extremely heavy brow, pronounced postorbital constriction, very small brain, and gigantic mouth. Beautifully preserved skull, but so different from anything we'd really seen in the fossil record. The underside of the skull is preserved beautifully, and sure enough, that big hole is coming right out of the bottom. So at Dmanisi, we find hominins that look like Neanderthals, some that look like erectus, Homo erectus, and some that look like something even more primitive, as the evolutionists would say. Something that looks maybe more like an Australopithecus.
Let's look at these skulls again and think about what he just said. He's saying that these skulls, all of whom lived almost the same time, show traits all the way from what he considered almost Australopithecus to Homo erectus to later humans. Why didn't he include this data on that chart that he showed us earlier? It would have easily bridged the gap.
The jury is still out on exactly what to do with this, even my own creationist analysis. It seems to suggest that this has a lot in common, a lot more in common with other members of Homo than any of these other groups. But there's not a lot of character data yet available. There's been a paper published this year that I'm hoping to be able to analyze more carefully. But as of this point, I would provisionally guess possibly this is human, maybe. Ask me next week and I may have a different idea. Probably not. This is probably human.
Well, since all species in the genus Homo are considered human, I'm going to have to agree with him there, but definitely not Homo sapiens or anything close to a modern human.
Now, why is that significant? Why is Dmanisi significant? Well, remember, it's southern Georgia. That's where Dmanisi is located. Isn't that remarkable? It is roughly, if you Google map it, it's about 200 miles from the mountains of Ararat. So the mountains of Ararat would be somewhere in this region as well. You might even think that Dmanisi is within the mountains of Ararat. We're not entirely sure what those mountains were. But I find it startling and really strange and a remarkable coincidence that when you find the oldest humans that you can find closest to Ararat, they turn out to be the biggest diversity of any single population anywhere.
So these are post-flood humans that made it off the ark and descended from Noah, ended up a few hundred miles away in Dmanisi and had tiny brain cases. And, you know, I've just never heard this before from any other creationist.
Now, if I'm right, and these things do all descend from Adam and Eve, then I would expect that this happened very early on, and that if you could see the population that built Babel, it would be very, very, very diverse. And what do you know? Here at Dmanisi, I find the highest diversity in a single location. Now, I don't know if that's significant. It's certainly striking. I certainly find that amazing. It makes me giggle.
Gotta be honest, it makes me giggle too.
It's not conclusive because the fossil record of hominins is so poorly sampled. Africa is practically unexplored, the majority of the African continent. There's still new wonders to be discovered. So for now, I'm thinking that's pretty neat, but let's see what we find next. So what can we think about the Tower of Babel? Well, I think we need to remember one thing is that it's not just linguistic confusion. It is a complete shattering of human culture. These people had gathered together to build a city. And we know from cities today, even little towns today, that cities are built by the division of labor. This guy becomes a blacksmith, that guy becomes a stonecutter, these guys are going to tend the sheep, those guys are going to plant the corn, Everybody has their own little job to do. That's how cities work. So as I think about Babel, suddenly you wake up in a city and you're not able to talk to anyone. You're not able to communicate anyone. God has judged you for not scattering and dispersing across the earth as he commanded. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But here's the problem. You eventually find a couple of people that you can talk to, but turns out that one's an accountant, that one's a movie producer, this one's a college professor. None of them have any practical skills. What are you going to do? Right? You're going to be back to the Stone Age, as they say. And yeah, you know why you find stone tools, the first in the fossil record of humans? Because that's the best anyone was really doing. They all remembered the culture of Babel, but no one group had all the ingredients to be able to replicate it.
Okay, there's your accountant on the left, the college professor on the right. Yeah, I got to hand it to him. He's really making up a story here, trying to shoehorn the evidence that we find for these early humans into a biblical narrative.
So, several generations are spent reconstructing culture and technology. So when we look into the fossil record and we find all these stone tools and all these weird bone tools and other implements, we are seeing those generations recovering from the shock of the Tower of Babel. And as I said, some of these groups are going to have no practical skills at all. You put a bunch of college professors out there. I should know I was a college professor. I couldn't survive in the woods overnight, much less much longer than that. It'd be rough.
He's just going for the jokes now. Let's see if he can pull it all together and give us a real good conclusion here at the end of his lecture.
And so, as we look back now, we think that they appear very primitive. We think they look like animals. Because morphologically, some of them sort of do, and behaviorally, well, they're not very advanced. Because that's exactly right. They've been de-advanced from their culture.
But there's absolutely no evidence of anything like a modern human culture existing at the time of any of these fossils. And there's certainly no evidence of any of it existing before that.
So one final slide here, just to make sure everybody understands what I'm saying. These guys, not human, they're on this sort of a tree. They're dispersing and moving around and diversifying just after the flood and prior to Babel. These guys are humans. They're staying in Babel. They're interbreeding. They're probably generating a lot of diversity right there in Babel. And then after Babel, they spread out. And one of those lineages becomes, in some sense, the dominant biological lineage. Neanderthals and Erectus, that may have been just a small tribe here or there that looked different from other people.
Let's jump back to the beginning of the first video where he told us he was going to tell us about ape men and Adam. He separated the fossils into pre-flood and post-flood, but he never really told us who Adam was. You know, if we went by what he's telling us, Adam must have looked something like this.
Lingering questions. What about the human genome? I didn't say anything about the human genome, and you're right, I haven't. That's a need to integrate into this work. What about the radiometric dating? I've referred to some of these as 1 to 2 million years old. What does that mean for creationism? That's something that needs to be addressed. And of course, what about the next big fossil discovery? We've just had Sediba and Naledi. What's coming next? I can't wait to find out. Thank you.
You know, Todd Wood does not deny the evidence. He knows the evidence well, but he hasn't found a way yet to make that evidence fit into a biblical narrative or a young earth creationist worldview.